Some secrets are deadlier than others. Sophie Caldwell thought she had it all: a loving husband, two beautiful children, and a stable life in the suburbs. But everything changes when she stumbles upon a shocking secret. Her husband, Daniel, is entangled in a forbidden affair. What begins as a personal betrayal soon spirals into a dark conspiracy involving money laundering, dangerous criminals, and life-threatening secrets. Determined to protect her family, Sophie plunges into a world of deception and danger. As the stakes escalate, she realizes that the people she trusted most have been plotting against her, turning her life into a twisted game where she is the perfect pawn. With her children's safety on the line and ruthless criminals closing in, Sophie must race against time to expose the truth before she becomes their next victim. But when every move she makes is watched and every ally she thought she had turns into an enemy, how far will she go to survive? Based on a true story. Before we dive into this powerful story, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you find it compelling, don't forget to hit subscribe. Sophie Caldwell hummed softly as she set the table, her hands moving with practiced ease. The glow of candles flickered across the dining room, casting a warm, inviting light that enveloped the small but cozy space. Tonight was supposed to be special. It was her 10th wedding anniversary, and she had gone all out to make it perfect, cooking Daniel's favorite meal, wearing the red dress he loved, and even opening a bottle of their finest wine to breathe. But as the hours ticked by, Sophie's excitement slowly turned into worry, then frustration. Daniel was late again. She had called him twice already, both calls going straight to voicemail. He had promised he would be home early, yet it was nearly 10 p.m. The dinner she had so meticulously prepared was now cold, the wine untouched. She stared at her phone, willing it to ring, but it remained silent. Her heart sank as she blew out the candles. The once warm ambience was now nothing more than a mockery of her efforts. Sophie sank into a chair, her fingers tracing the rim of her wine glass as doubts swirled in her mind. This wasn't the first time Daniel had been late. For the past few months, his behavior had changed. He was distant, distracted, always with some excuse about work. But tonight, on their anniversary, this felt like a new low. Suddenly, the sound of the front door creaking open broke her thoughts. Sophie straightened up, her heart leaping. She hurried to the hallway, where Daniel was slipping out of his coat. He looked disheveled, his shirt wrinkled, and his hair tousled as if he had been running his hands through it all night. "You're late," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I told you I had a late meeting," Daniel replied, not meeting her eyes as he shuffled past her toward the kitchen. Sophie's nose wrinkled. There it was again, a faint scent of cologne, sharp and unfamiliar, mixed with cigarette smoke. Daniel didn't smoke, and the cologne certainly wasn't hers. A cold knot tightened in her stomach. "Couldn't you have at least called?" Sophie pressed, following him. "I made us dinner." Daniel sighed heavily, rubbing the back of his neck. "I'm sorry, Sophie. Things are just complicated at work right now." It was the same excuse he had used a dozen times before, but this time, it felt emptier than ever. Sophie studied him closely, her instincts screaming that something was wrong. But she bit her tongue. She didn't want to ruin what was left of their anniversary. As he retreated upstairs for a shower, Sophie's eyes landed on his phone, abandoned on the counter. Her heart hammered in her chest. She had never been one to invade his privacy, but tonight, her desperation got the better of her. She reached for the phone, her fingers trembling. It was locked, but she knew the code. For a moment, she hesitated, the guilt gnawing at her, but she couldn't stop herself. As soon as she unlocked it, a flurry of messages appeared on the screen. They were from an unknown number. "I miss you. Can't stop thinking about last night. Same time tomorrow? We need to be careful. She's getting suspicious." Sophie's breath caught in her throat. She felt as though the ground had opened beneath her feet. This was it, the confirmation of her worst fears. Daniel was cheating on her. The messages were intimate, urgent, and filled with a sense of secrecy that made her stomach churn. Tears stung her eyes, but anger quickly took over. How dare he do this to her? On their anniversary, no less. The fury drove her upstairs, where Daniel was still in the shower. She threw open the bathroom door, her voice trembling with rage. "Who is she, Daniel?" she demanded, holding up his phone. "I saw the messages." Daniel's eyes widened in shock, but only for a split second. Then his face hardened, and he snatched the phone from her hand. "You went through my phone? What the hell, Sophie? Don't turn this around on me," she shot back. "I deserve to know who you've been sneaking around with." But instead of answering, Daniel simply glared at her. "I don't have time for your paranoia," he muttered as he pushed past her, leaving the bathroom dripping wet. He quickly dressed, grabbed his keys, and stormed out the front door without another word, leaving Sophie standing there, shaking with a mix of fury and disbelief. Alone in the silence of their empty house, Sophie's rage turned to despair. Was this really happening? Had her entire marriage been a lie? But as her tears began to fall, they were quickly replaced by something else: resolve. If Daniel thought she was just going to roll over and accept his lies, he was dead wrong. Wiping her eyes, Sophie grabbed her car keys. She had seen enough in those messages to know that Daniel was meeting someone again tonight. If he thought he could continue deceiving her, he had another thing coming. She was going to get to the bottom of this, no matter how much it hurt. The drive to the location mentioned in one of the texts was tense and filled with dread. Sophie's hands gripped the steering wheel so hard her knuckles turned white. She parked a safe distance away from the address, a secluded cabin on the outskirts of town. The lights were on inside, the faint silhouettes of two figures moving around visible through the drawn curtains. Her breath hitched as she squinted through the darkness, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. Daniel was there, all right, but he wasn't alone. To her shock, he was embracing another person. Sophie's heart stopped when she realized the person wasn't a woman. It was a man she recognized, Aaron, their longtime family friend. The sight felt like a knife to her heart. This wasn't just an affair. It was a secret so deep and twisted that it threatened to unravel everything she knew about her husband, her marriage, and even her own sense of reality. As she fought back sobs, the hair on the back of her neck prickled. Someone was approaching her car. She turned to see a shadowy figure tapping on her window. Her blood ran cold. "You shouldn't be here," the stranger growled, his voice low and menacing. "If you know what's good for you, you'll forget what you saw." Panicking, Sophie slammed the car into reverse and sped away, her heart pounding. The message was clear. This was far bigger than just a cheating husband. Whatever Daniel was involved in, it was dangerous, perhaps even deadly. And now, she was caught right in the middle of it. The drive home was a blur. Sophie's hands were shaking so badly she could barely keep the car steady on the road. Her mind replayed the scene she had witnessed over and over, like a nightmare she couldn't escape. Daniel with Aaron. The intimate embrace. The menacing warning from the stranger. What had she gotten herself into? Sophie's heart was still racing by the time she pulled into her driveway. The house was dark and quiet, an oppressive silence hanging in the air. She slipped inside, her footsteps echoing in the emptiness. It was well past midnight, but sleep was out of the question. She needed answers. And she needed them now. She went straight to the kitchen, her hands trembling as she brewed a pot of strong coffee. She would need all the focus she could muster. Her mind was racing with questions. Why was Daniel meeting Aaron in secret? What was their connection to that stranger who had threatened her? And, most importantly, how deep did this go? Her eyes drifted to Daniel's laptop sitting on the counter, the screensaver flickering dimly in the darkness. He had always been paranoid about security, but tonight, Sophie didn't care. Desperation trumped guilt. If there were any answers to be found, she would find them. Sophie quickly booted up the laptop, her heart hammering as she entered the password she had seen him type countless times before. It took a few tries, but eventually, she was in. She navigated through his emails, scanning for anything that might explain his secret meetings. Most of it was the usual work correspondence, but then she found a hidden folder tucked away in the depths of his drive. The name was innocuous enough: finances. Clicking it open, Sophie was greeted with a flurry of encrypted files. Frustrated, she almost gave up until she found one that wasn't locked. It was an Excel sheet labeled simply, "Transactions." As she scrolled through, her confusion quickly turned to horror. The ledger was filled with large sums of money being transferred between shadowy accounts. The dates lined up suspiciously with Daniel's late-night meetings. And there, next to each transaction, was Aaron's name. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just about an affair, it was something far more dangerous. She was in way over her head. Before she could process what she was seeing, her phone vibrated on the counter, making her jump. The screen flashed with a message from an unknown number. "You didn't listen. Stop snooping if you want your kids to stay safe." Her blood ran cold. Whoever had approached her at the cabin had clearly been watching her every move. Panic gripped her, and she hurriedly closed the laptop, her mind racing. This wasn't just about Daniel's betrayal anymore. Now, her children were being threatened. Sophie's fear quickly turned to resolve. If someone thought they could intimidate her into silence, they were wrong. She wasn't going to let anyone threaten her family. She needed more evidence, something solid to take to the police. But she had to be smart about it. Whoever these people were, they clearly had eyes on her. With a newfound sense of urgency, Sophie went upstairs to the master bedroom. She opened Daniel's closet, sifting through his neatly hung suits and ties. It felt surreal, rifling through the belongings of a man she thought she knew. But she was past the point of second-guessing herself. Near the back of the closet, hidden behind a stack of old files, she found a small metal box. It was locked, but with a few twists of a hairpin, she managed to force it open. Inside, there were more documents, bank statements, offshore accounts, and receipts for large cash deposits. Her heart sank as she realized the scale of Daniel's involvement in something illegal. But one document caught her eye. It was a contract of sorts, with both Daniel's and Aaron's signatures at the bottom. The terms were vague, but hinted at money laundering and investments tied to a shady corporation she didn't recognize. Before she could examine it further, the creak of the front door sent her heart into overdrive. Daniel was back. Sophie's mind raced as she quickly shoved the documents back into the box and locked it. She stashed it back in the closet and composed herself just as Daniel's footsteps echoed up the stairs. He appeared in the doorway, his eyes bloodshot and a scowl etched on his face. "Still up?" he asked, his voice rough. "I thought we were done fighting." Sophie forced a smile, her heart thudding painfully against her ribs. "I was just cleaning up," she lied, praying he couldn't see through her facade. Daniel's eyes lingered on her for a moment too long, his gaze sharp and suspicious. But then, with a tired sigh, he turned and headed for the shower. Sophie's knees nearly gave out as she heard the water running, relief washing over her. She had bought herself a little more time, but she knew she was running out of it. Whoever was watching her clearly wouldn't hesitate to follow through on their threats. And if Daniel was willing to risk everything to protect his secrets, there was no telling what he would do if he found out she had been snooping. As Sophie stood in the darkened hallway, she made a silent vow. She would protect her children, no matter what. But first, she needed to uncover the full truth before it was too late. Sleep eluded Sophie that night. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the weight of her discoveries pressing down on her like a lead blanket. The image of Daniel embracing Aaron, the threatening message on her phone, the hidden bank transactions, each revelation felt like another piece of a horrifying puzzle that was only beginning to take shape. When dawn finally broke, Sophie made a decision. She couldn't keep running on fear and half-truths. If she was going to protect her children, she needed answers directly from the source. She would confront Daniel. But first, she needed leverage. Sophie waited until Daniel left for work before returning to the metal box she had found in the closet the previous night. This time, she photographed every document, focusing on the ones that tied Daniel to the mysterious financial transactions and Aaron's involvement. The documents were damning, filled with jargon about offshore accounts and suspiciously large sums of money funneling through shell companies. But as she was photographing the last document, she noticed a line that sent a chill down her spine. It referenced payments to a third party for discreet services rendered. The amount was staggering. Her mind spun with possibilities, none of them good. With her phone full of evidence, Sophie drove to Daniel's office downtown. The building was sleek and modern, reflecting the polished image Daniel had always presented to the world. She walked through the lobby, her nerves thrumming, and rode the elevator to the 20th floor. When she arrived at his office, the receptionist gave her a tight smile. "Mr. Caldwell is in a meeting," she said. "Can I?" "He'll want to see me," Sophie interrupted, her voice colder than she intended. "Tell him it's urgent." Minutes later, Sophie was ushered into Daniel's corner office. He was seated behind his desk, his eyes narrowed with a mix of surprise and irritation. "What's this about, Sophie?" he asked, leaning back in his leather chair. Sophie didn't waste any time. She pulled out her phone and showed him the photographs she had taken. "Care to explain what all of this is?" she demanded, her voice trembling with barely contained rage. Daniel's face went pale, his confident demeanor faltering for the first time. He stood up, closing the blinds to his office windows before turning to face her. "You shouldn't have gone through my things," he said, his voice low, almost a growl. "Don't you dare try to turn this around on me," Sophie shot back. "I've seen the messages, the transactions, the contracts. I know you've been laundering money, and I know Aaron is involved. But what I don't understand is why. And who else is pulling the strings?" Daniel ran a hand through his hair, his eyes darting toward the door as if he expected someone to burst in at any moment. Finally, he let out a sigh, sinking into his chair. "It's not what you think," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Aaron got me involved. He needed help, and I owed him." "Owed him for what?" Sophie demanded. "Is this why you've been sneaking around?" "Because of some debt to Aaron." Daniel's jaw clenched, his eyes flashing with a mix of anger and desperation. "It started as a favor," he confessed. "Aaron got into trouble with some bad people who don't forgive debts easily. I thought I could help him, but it got out of control. They used me, Sophie. They used us." Sophie's mind reeled. She wanted to believe him, to see him as the victim in all of this. But there was something in his eyes, a flicker of guilt, that told her he was still holding back. "Why didn't you come to me?" she asked, her voice breaking. "We could have found a way out together." Daniel's expression softened for a moment, but then his gaze hardened again. "You don't understand, Sophie," he said. "These aren't people you can just walk away from. They own you. They own everything." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "If they even suspect that you're involved, they'll come for you. For the kids." The threat hung in the air like a dagger. Sophie's resolve wavered, but she couldn't let go of the feeling that there was more to the story. "What about the affair, Daniel?" she pressed. "I saw you with Aaron. It wasn't just business, was it?" Daniel's face crumpled, and he looked away, unable to meet her eyes. "No," he admitted. "It started as a way to protect him, to keep him close while we were in this mess. But it became something more. I was trying to protect both of you. I thought if I kept you in the dark, you'd be safe." Sophie's heart twisted painfully. The man she thought she knew was a stranger, someone who had lied and betrayed her in ways she couldn't even begin to process. But before she could respond, Daniel's phone buzzed on his desk. He glanced at the screen, his eyes widening. "They know you're here," he hissed, grabbing her arm. "We have to go. Now." Sophie barely had time to react before Daniel was pulling her through a side door that led to a private stairwell. "What's going on?" she demanded as they descended the steps two at a time. "They've been watching me," Daniel said, his voice frantic. "I don't know how, but they've known every move I've made. And now they know you're involved." Sophie's blood ran cold. The stranger's warning at the cabin, the threatening texts, it all made sense now. They were being hunted, and it was only a matter of time before whoever was pulling the strings made their move. When they reached the ground floor, Daniel led her to a nondescript car parked in the alley. "Get in," he ordered. Sophie hesitated for a moment, but climbed into the passenger seat. As they sped away, her mind raced with everything she had just learned. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice tight with fear. "To someone who can help us," Daniel replied, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. "But we have to move fast. If we're caught." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Sophie knew what was at stake. As they drove through the city, the sense of dread that had been gnawing at her since last night only grew. But as they turned down a darkened street, Sophie noticed something strange. A black SUV had been following them since they left Daniel's office. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I think we're being followed." Daniel's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, his face tightening. "Hold on," he said, slamming his foot on the gas. The car lurched forward, tires squealing as they sped down the narrow street. Sophie's heart was in her throat as they weaved through traffic, the SUV closing in behind them. She clutched her seat, praying they would make it out alive. But deep down, she knew this was just the beginning. The secrets Daniel had kept hidden were darker and more dangerous than she could have imagined. And now, they were running out of time. The car screeched around another corner, narrowly avoiding a collision with a parked truck. Sophie's knuckles were white as she gripped the door handle, her heart hammering in her chest. The black SUV was still on their tail, relentless in its pursuit. Daniel's face was a mask of concentration, his eyes flicking between the road ahead and the rearview mirror. "Daniel, where are we going?" Sophie shouted over the roar of the engine. "There's a safe house not far from here," Daniel replied through gritted teeth. "Aaron set it up for emergencies. We can regroup there." The mention of Aaron's name sent a fresh wave of nausea through Sophie. Despite everything she had learned, she still couldn't fully process the betrayal. Her husband's affair was bad enough, but discovering it was tied to criminal activities had pushed her past the point of disbelief. Suddenly, the SUV rammed into their rear bumper, jolting them forward. Daniel cursed under his breath, swerving sharply to avoid a collision. "They're trying to run us off the road," he muttered. "We need to lose them now." Just as the tension seemed unbearable, Daniel made a sharp turn down a narrow alleyway. The SUV skidded to a halt, unable to follow. For a brief, blessed moment, they were in the clear. Sophie let out a shaky breath as Daniel slowed the car to a crawl, carefully navigating through a maze of side streets. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving her exhausted and terrified. "I need answers, Daniel," she demanded. "No more lies. What the hell is really going on?" Daniel's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his jaw clenched. For a moment, she thought he might refuse to answer. But then, with a heavy sigh, he began to speak. "Aaron wasn't just my lover," Daniel confessed, his voice low and hoarse. "He was the one who got me involved with these people in the first place. We were laundering money through shell companies. At first, it was just to clear Aaron's debts, but then, we got greedy." Sophie's eyes widened in disbelief. So this was never about protecting him? It was all about the money. "No," Daniel snapped, but the guilt in his eyes betrayed him. "I got in too deep. They threatened us, Sophie. If we didn't keep funneling their money, they promised to come after you and the kids." Her stomach twisted. This was far worse than she'd imagined. "You lied to me for years," she whispered, tears stinging her eyes. "You put our family in danger for money?" Daniel didn't answer. The silence that followed was deafening, filled only by the sound of the engine as they sped through the darkened streets. Sophie felt like she was suffocating, trapped in a nightmare with no way out. As they approached the outskirts of the city, Daniel made another sudden turn, this time into a secluded industrial area. They pulled up to a dilapidated warehouse, its windows dark and foreboding. "We'll be safe here," he said, cutting the engine. "For now." But as they climbed out of the car, Sophie's instincts screamed that something was wrong. The place was too quiet, too empty. She turned to Daniel, her suspicions flaring. "How do you know this place is safe?" Before he could answer, the sound of a gun cocking echoed through the air. Sophie whirled around to see Aaron stepping out of the shadows, a cold smile on his lips. "You weren't supposed to bring her here, Daniel," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "What the hell is this?" Sophie shouted, her heart sinking as she looked between the two men. I thought you were on our side. Aaron's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. Oh, Sophie, you really don't get it, do you? He turned to Daniel, shaking his head. I told you she was too curious for her own good. Daniel's face paled. Aaron, this isn't what we agreed. Shut up, Aaron snapped, cutting him off. You think I'm going to let you screw this up for me? The plan was to frame Sophie and let her take the fall. She's the perfect scapegoat. Sophie's blood turned to ice. What? She breathed, her voice barely more than a whisper. You were going to frame me? Aaron nodded, his eyes glinting with malice. We needed a way out, and you were the perfect pawn. A grieving wife who just found out her husband was cheating? No one would question it if you took the blame for everything. The realization hit Sophie like a physical blow. The affair, the money laundering, the threats, it had all been part of a plan to set her up. And Daniel had been in on it. You were going to let them ruin my life, she said, her voice cracking with the weight of betrayal. To protect yourselves? Daniel's eyes were full of desperation as he turned to her. I didn't want to do it, Sophie, he pleaded. I was trying to protect you. They would have killed us all if we didn't. Save it, Sophie spat, her eyes blazing with fury. I trusted you, and you betrayed me in the worst way possible. Aaron raised his gun, pointing it directly at her. Enough with the melodrama, he said. It's time to end this. But just as he pulled the trigger, a deafening blast rang out from behind them. Aaron stumbled, clutching his shoulder as blood began to pour from the wound. Sophie turned to see a dark figure emerging from the shadows, the same stranger who had threatened her at the cabin. You think I'm going to let you idiots ruin my operation? The stranger growled, his gun trained on both Aaron and Daniel. You've been sloppy, and now you're going to pay for it. In the chaos that followed, Sophie didn't hesitate. She grabbed a heavy metal pipe lying nearby and swung it at Aaron, knocking him unconscious before he could recover. The stranger turned his gun on Daniel, but Sophie was faster. She slammed the pipe into Daniel's side, sending him crashing to the ground. Panting and covered in sweat, Sophie grabbed her phone and ran, ignoring Daniel's cries for help. She had the evidence she needed, and now she had to get it to the authorities before it was too late. As she sprinted toward the nearest exit, the stranger's voice echoed behind her. Run all you want, lady, but you'll never escape us. But Sophie had no intention of running. She was done being a pawn in their twisted game. It was time to turn the tables, once and for all. Sophie's heart pounded in her ears as she sprinted through the dark, deserted streets. The weight of the phone in her pocket felt like her only lifeline. She had the evidence, photos of the documents, recorded confessions, and enough proof to expose Daniel and Aaron's crimes. But she knew that as long as those criminals were after her, she was far from safe. The stranger's words echoed in her mind, "You'll never escape us." But Sophie refused to let fear paralyze her. She had come too far to turn back now. Her children's safety depended on her, and she wasn't about to let them down. She turned a corner, her breath coming in ragged gasps, and spotted a small 24-hour diner at the end of the street. Its neon sign flickered in the night, a beacon of hope. Pushing through the door, she rushed inside and made her way to a payphone in the back corner. Her hands trembled as she dialed Detective Ramirez's number, the one person she could trust. She prayed he would answer. The phone rang twice before a gruff voice picked up. Detective Ramirez speaking. It's Sophie Caldwell, she whispered, glancing nervously around the diner. I have everything, the evidence, the recordings. They're trying to kill me. You have to help. Where are you? Ramirez's tone turned urgent. I'm at Joe's diner on 5th, Sophie replied. But I don't have much time. They're on to me. Stay put, Ramirez ordered. I'm sending a squad car now. Do not move. But even as he spoke, Sophie's instinct screamed that she was already out of time. She hung up and looked around the nearly empty diner. The only patrons were a trucker nursing a coffee and the cook behind the counter. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were on her. Just as she thought she could catch her breath, the bell above the door jingled. Sophie's heart sank. A man in a dark hoodie stepped in, his gaze sweeping the diner before locking onto her. The icy fear from earlier gripped her once more. She had to move now. Without hesitation, Sophie bolted through the back door, bursting into the alley behind the diner. The cold night air stung her lungs as she ran. She heard footsteps behind her, fast and heavy, closing in. She couldn't afford to get caught, not when she was so close to exposing the truth. Ahead, the faint sound of sirens wailed, growing louder. Hope surged through her veins. Ramirez's squad car was near. But as she turned down another alley, a powerful arm grabbed her from behind, yanking her off her feet. Sophie struggled, kicking and thrashing as her attacker tried to drag her toward a waiting car. It was the same stranger who had threatened her before, his grip like a vice around her arm. "You should have stayed out of this, lady," he growled. "Now, you're going to disappear just like your husband." A surge of rage and desperation gave Sophie newfound strength. She reached into her pocket, pulling out the pepper spray she always carried. She sprayed it directly into the stranger's eyes, and he screamed in agony, loosening his grip just enough for her to break free. Without looking back, Sophie sprinted toward the flashing red and blue lights at the end of the alley. 2 police officers jumped out of their cruiser as she stumbled toward them. "Help! They're trying to kill me!" she cried. Ramirez stepped out from behind the squad car, his stern face softening as he approached. "Sophie, you're safe now," he said, wrapping a protective arm around her shoulders. But Sophie knew it wasn't over. "I have the evidence," she gasped, pulling her phone from her pocket. "Everything you need to bring them down." Ramirez took the phone, quickly scanning through the files. His eyes widened as he realized the depth of the conspiracy. "You've done well," he said. "This is more than enough to put them away." Relief washed over Sophie like a tidal wave. But as they led her to the safety of the squad car, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. "What about Daniel?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Is he?" Ramirez's expression darkened. "We've put out an alert for him, but he's gone underground. Don't worry. We'll find him." As they drove away, the adrenaline finally began to ebb, leaving Sophie exhausted and hollow. She watched the city lights blur past, knowing her life would never be the same. Her trust was shattered, her heart broken, but she had protected her children. That was all that mattered. A few days later, Sophie sat in her living room, surrounded by packed boxes. She had decided to move with her children to a new city, far from the nightmare she had survived. As she taped up the last box, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from an unknown sender. The subject line read, "This isn't over." Sophie's hands trembled as she opened the message. It contained only a single line, "You may have escaped once, but we'll be watching." Her breath caught in her throat. She looked around the empty house, her heart pounding once more. The nightmare wasn't over. Not yet.